She ate in the kitchen with the maid, right in the house she had paid for. 63 years old, widowed, and being bossed around in the kitchen like a servant by her daughter-in-law, in front of everyone she had ever thought of as family. No one said a word, not even her son. But what Celeste didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that Vivian Mercer had never been just a docile, silent, easily pushed around mother. She was waiting, and she had been preparing for a long time. If you want to know what happens when a woman decides not to be silent anymore, watch until the end. Like, and leave a comment with the name of the city you're watching, so I can see how far my story has come. The invitation came on a Tuesday in October, which should have told me something right there, because Ethan never called on Tuesdays. He called on Sunday mornings when Celeste was at her yoga class, when he had exactly 40 minutes of breathing room before she came back through the front door smelling like lavender and entitlement. That's when my son remembered he had a mother. But that Tuesday, my phone rang at 6:47 in the evening, and his name lit up the screen, and I did what I always did. I answered before the second ring. Mom. His voice had that particular texture I'd learned to read over the years, the way you learn to read weather. Not quite warm, not quite cold, somewhere in that gray zone where Ethan Mercer lived most of his life. We're doing a dinner Saturday. Celeste thought it would be nice to have you over. Celeste thought. That was the first tell. I was standing in my kitchen at the time, a small rental apartment in Millhaven with windows that rattled when the wind came in off the ridge. I had a cup of chamomile tea cooling on the counter and a library book open on the table. A mystery novel, the kind where you know from page one that nothing is going to go the way anyone expects. I remember thinking later that maybe the universe was trying to give me a hint. That sounds lovely, I said, because that's what I did. That's what I had been doing for 7 years. Let me tell you something about the word lovely. It is the most dangerous word in the English language for a woman my age, because it means nothing and costs everything. Every time I said lovely to Celeste, every time I smiled at her cold little comments, every time I pretended not to notice the way she looked at me like I was something tracked in on the bottom of someone's shoe, I gave away a small piece of something I would never get back. I gave away 7 years of lovely. My name is Vivian Mercer. I'm 63 years old. I was married to Robert Mercer for 31 years, and when he died of a heart attack on a Wednesday morning in February, 4 years before this story begins, he left behind a wife who knew how to grieve quietly, a son who didn't know how to grieve at all, and a financial situation that neither of them fully understood. Robert was a builder, not the flashy kind, not the kind who put his name on glass towers downtown. He was the kind of man who saw a piece of land and understood it, who knew which neighborhoods were going to turn, which properties were undervalued, which investments people were too scared or too short-sighted to make. He'd grown up with nothing, and that had given him a particular clarity about money, not what it said about you, but what it could do for you, what it could protect. We built that together, slowly, carefully, the way you build anything worth keeping. While other couples spent on vacations and dining rooms and private schools, Robert and I invested in land, in properties, in accounts that didn't announce themselves. We lived below our means because we understood that wealth displayed is wealth vulnerable. And when Robert died, I inherited everything, not a comfortable sum, not a nice nest egg, everything. But I was 60 years old and I was drowning in grief. And the world had a particular cruelty it reserved for widows of a certain age. People saw a small woman in a modest apartment with a library book and a cup of chamomile tea, and they assumed they understood the whole story. Nobody looked at Vivian Mercer and thought, that woman could buy this building. Celeste certainly didn't. I met Celeste Hargrove. She kept her own name, which was fine, except she kept it the way a flag is kept, planted on conquered territory, at a dinner 3 months after Ethan started dating her. She was 34 to his 37, with the kind of beauty that required maintenance and knew it. Blonde hair that was professional blonde, not natural blonde. Nails always done. Posture that came from a childhood where someone told her repeatedly that how you carried yourself was how the world would carry you. She was not a bad person, I told myself then. She was just a person who had organized her entire life around the belief that some people mattered more than others, and had developed very specific opinions about which category I fell into. The first time I came to their home for dinner, this was before the estate, when they were still in Ethan's condo, She offered me wine in a way that felt like a test. When I said I didn't drink, she smiled and said, "Oh, how interesting," in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. That was the first shot. Over the years, they came in different shapes. Comments about my clothes that were framed as concern. Questions about my health that were really assessments of my inconvenience. The time she referred to me as Ethan's situation in a conversation she didn't know I overheard. The way she always managed to schedule family events on dates she knew conflicted with my commitments, then expressed such warm disappointment when I couldn't attend. None of it was proof of anything. That was the craft of it. Each thing was small enough to be dismissed, explained, forgiven. It was only when you stood back and looked at all of it together that you saw the architecture, the careful, patient architecture of a woman who had decided that her husband's mother was a problem to be managed until she could be eliminated. And Ethan, my son, my boy, the child I had sat with through chickenpox and heartbreaks and the terrible year he failed out of his first semester at college and thought his life was over. Ethan let it happen. Not because he was cruel, because he was weak in the specific way that love makes people weak, and because Celeste was very good at making him feel that choosing her was the brave thing, the mature thing, the thing a real man did. She had convinced him, somehow, that loving his wife and loving his mother were mutually exclusive activities, and he had believed her. The estate was called Harrow Hill, though that wasn't its official name. It was what Celeste called it, had called it from the moment they signed the papers, because she needed everything in her life to have a name that sounded like old money, even when the money was new. Ethan and Celeste had purchased the property 3 years ago. 6 bedrooms, 4.5 baths, a kitchen that had been featured in a local design magazine, a back garden with a stone terrace where Celeste hosted the kind of parties that ended up photographed for social media accounts with 40,000 followers. They had purchased it with a down payment that came, in large part, from me. That part is important. I want you to understand it clearly, because it matters for everything that comes after. When Ethan called to tell me they'd found the house, his voice had a particular quality, not quite asking, not quite telling. He explained that they were just barely short, that it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, that the market was moving and they couldn't wait. He didn't say, "Please, Mom." He didn't have to. I wired the money within 48 hours. And then, because Robert had taught me to protect what I'd built, I did something that Ethan and Celeste knew about and quickly chose to forget. I had an attorney draw up the documentation. The contribution was structured not as a gift, but as a secured interest. I was, legally speaking, a partial owner of Harrow Hill. The papers were signed, the papers were filed, and then Celeste hung her curtains and her art and her curated life on the walls of a house she believed was entirely hers, and nobody spoke of the paperwork again. I didn't push it. That wasn't why I'd done it. I'd done it because I loved my son, and because Robert always said that love without structure was just sentiment, and sentiment didn't hold up in court. I hadn't known then how much I would come to rely on that lesson. Saturday came the way October Saturdays do in Mill Haven, gray and still, and smelling faintly of wood smoke from the hills. I dressed carefully. Not to impress Celeste. I had long since understood that nothing I wore would impress Celeste, because my being there at all was the problem, not my clothes. I dressed carefully because I was a 63-year-old woman who believed in showing up for herself, even when no one else was going to. I wore my navy dress. The one Robert had always said made me look like I meant business without trying too hard. Low heels, pearl earrings that had been his mother's. A coat I'd had for 12 years and liked precisely because it had aged into something with character. I drove myself. I'd stopped accepting rides from Ethan after the 3rd time he arrived 40 minutes late and didn't apologize. The drive to Harrow Hill took 22 minutes. I listened to a jazz station the whole way. I sang along quietly to a Chet Baker song I'd known since college. And I felt, for those 22 minutes, like myself. Wholly, completely myself. Then I turned through the iron gate and saw the cars in the driveway. There were 7 of them, 7 cars. Several of which I recognized as expensive in the specific way that makes regular expensive look apologetic. A silver Mercedes. 2 Range Rovers. Something low and red that I didn't have a name for. Ethan had said dinner. He had not said gathering. He had not said Celeste social circle. He had not said performance. But of course he hadn't. That was never how it was presented. It was always just dinner. Always just a few people. Always just an arrangement that happened to place me in the most uncomfortable possible position while maintaining the technical truth that I had been invited. I sat in my car for a moment. Not long, 30 seconds, maybe less. Just enough to breathe. Then I got out and walked to the front door. Celeste answered before I could ring the bell, which meant she'd been watching. Vivian. She said my name the way you say the name of a dish you didn't order but were brought anyway, with a flat, managed politeness. She was in a dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, pale champagne. Her hair swept up in a way that looked effortless because she had spent considerable effort making it look that way. Come in, everyone's already gathered. Already, a small word, packed with meaning. The foyer was lit with the warm glow of the kind of lighting that doesn't happen by accident. Somewhere in the back rooms, conversation hummed and something orchestral played softly from speakers I couldn't see. The house smelled of catered food and expensive candles, and the particular self-satisfaction of a home that wants you to know exactly what it cost. I followed Celeste through the hallway, past the photographs on the wall. Ethan and Celeste on their honeymoon in Tuscany, Ethan and Celeste at some charity gala, Celeste alone in black and white, looking like she was auditioning for a perfume ad. There were no photographs of me. There never had been. The living room had been arranged for a gathering. 8 people stood or sat with glasses in hand, and for a moment nobody noticed me, which is its own particular kind of greeting. I recognized 2 of Celeste's friends from previous encounters. Margot, who wore her money loudly and her kindness sparingly, and Delia, who had once asked me if I lived in assisted housing without any trace of self-awareness. There were others I didn't know, a couple who matched each other in the way of people who have worked very hard to project a unified image. An older man with silver cufflinks, who gave off the particular energy of someone who valued his own opinion above everyone else's, and 2 women who were almost identical in the carefully groomed way of people from the same social circle. Ethan stood near the fireplace. When he saw me, something crossed his face. Relief, or guilt, or both. And he came forward. He was 44 years old now, my son, and the years of his marriage had done something subtle to his face. Not aged him, exactly, more like pressed something out of it. The ease he'd had as a younger man, the willingness to laugh, some quality of being at home in himself. It wasn't gone entirely, but it had been managed, the way everything in Celeste's world was managed. Mom. He hugged me, and it was a real hug, the kind that came from a real place, and for a second I let myself feel it. Glad you could make it. Of course, I said. Wouldn't miss it. And Celeste, standing 3 feet away, watched this exchange with an expression of absolute pleasantness that had nothing underneath it at all. The first hour was what I can only describe as civilized torture. I was introduced briefly to people who immediately returned to their conversations. I was handed a glass of sparkling water by a catering staff member who was more gracious about it than any of the guests. I sat in a chair near the window, slightly apart from the main cluster of people, not dramatically enough to be rude, but enough to make clear where I stood, and I watched. I had become very good at watching. Celeste moved through the room like a conductor. Every word, every gesture, every glance was orchestrated. She had that gift, or that training, I was never sure which, of making you feel like the room was happening because of her and would stop the moment she left. People lit up around her. Not because she was warm, exactly, but because she was so convinced of her own centrality that other people caught the conviction. She barely spoke to me during that hour. When she did, it was with the particular brand of public warmth she deployed around witnesses. A touch on my arm, a comment about my dress that was technically a compliment, a brief smile before she swept away to tend to someone more relevant to her evening. Ethan checked on me twice. The second time, he sat beside me for a few minutes and we talked about small things. A book I'd read, something funny his coworker had said, the ridge road that was being repaved and how inconvenient it was. Normal things. Mother and son things. I held those minutes carefully, the way you hold something you know is fragile. Then Celeste's voice lifted across the room. Ethan, darling, come settle this argument about the Beaumont account. And he was on his feet before he finished the thought. I watched him go. Awesome. Dinner was announced at 7:30. The table in Celeste's dining room was extraordinary. I'll give her that. Long dark wood, candles, flowers from what I suspected was a very expensive florist, place settings that were technically a form of architecture. Every chair had a name card in calligraphed script. I looked for mine. It wasn't there. Not missing, I realized after a confused moment. Not in the wrong place or fallen on the floor. Simply not there. 8 chairs, 8 name cards, Celeste, Ethan, Margot, Delia, the matching couple, the cufflink man, and one of the identical women. 8 people. I was not among them. I stood holding my water glass, looking at that table with its beautiful flowers and its careful arrangement, and something cold settled into my chest. Not shock? No. I was past shock. I was past the stage where these moments could shock me. It was something quieter and more dangerous than shock. It was confirmation. "Oh, Vivian," Celeste's voice behind me. I turned. She stood in the doorway with her champagne glass, and she had the look of someone delivering difficult news with great patience. "I should have mentioned this earlier. I'm sorry. I thought Ethan had told you. We only had place settings for 8. The caterers had a mix-up. It's been such a chaos." She let the explanation trail off gracefully, the way a real explanation never would. "We've set up something lovely for you in the kitchen. You'll be more comfortable there, honestly. Maria and the catering team are wonderful company." The room had gone quiet. In the particular way rooms go quiet, when something is happening that everyone pretends not to notice. I felt every person in that room not looking at me. Maria, a kind-faced woman in her 50s wearing a catering apron, appeared in the kitchen doorway and gave me a look of such genuine embarrassment on my behalf that it nearly undid me. Not my humiliation, hers for being made complicit in it. "Celeste," Ethan's voice from somewhere behind her. Low. A warning or an attempt at one. "It's absolutely fine," Celeste said. Not to him, not to me, to the room. To the assembled audience of her social circle, who were now studiously examining the table arrangement, the candles, their own hands. "It'll be cozy, very informal." She looked at me then, and for just a fraction of a second, beneath the smile I saw it. The satisfaction she was trying to contain. She had wanted to do this. She had planned this. This wasn't a catering mix-up. This was a message. Here's what I want you to understand about that moment. I was not naive. I had known for years what Celeste thought of me. I had known, in the way you know the weather is coming before the sky shows it, that she was working towards something, some final arrangement in which I simply ceased to be a presence in my son's life. But knowing something and standing in front of a beautifully set table with no place for you while 8 people look at the floor, those are different countries. My hands were steady. I want you to know that. My hands, holding that glass of sparkling water, did not shake. I looked at Celeste. I looked at Ethan. At my son, standing just behind his wife with his jaw tight and his eyes doing that thing they did when he was ashamed of himself, that slight downward tilt like he was examining the middle distance for an exit. He did not say anything. He did not say, "That's my mother. She'll sit at the table." He did not say, "What is wrong with you?" He did not say a single word. And that, more than Celeste's smile, more than the missing chair, more than any of the 7 years of small cruelties that had preceded this moment, that silence was what broke something open inside me. Not broke it apart, broke it open, the way a walnut breaks to show what's been waiting inside. I felt something shift, settle, go still. "Of course," I said. My voice was even. I was proud of my voice. "I'd love to meet Maria." I walked into the kitchen. Maria Vasquez had been in the catering business for 22 years. She told me this over the first course, the beef broth with hand-rolled pasta that the staff ate standing at the counter while the dining room got the plated version with the garnish. She told me this while she was also directing 2 younger staff members with the efficiency of someone who had learned to run a kitchen the way generals run campaigns, and while maintaining a conversation with me that she clearly sensed I needed. She had a daughter at community college and a husband who built custom furniture. She lived 40 minutes south of Millhaven in a town called Farron, where the houses were small but the neighbors knew your name. She had worked for Celeste's events 3 times before and had, in that careful way of someone who needed the paycheck but had not lost their soul, very little to say about their hostess. "The food is good, at least," Maria said, setting a bowl in front of me with the dignity of someone who understood that how you served a person said everything. "I make sure of that part." "It's wonderful," I said and meant it. We talked for 20 minutes about her daughter, about a furniture show her husband had won an award at, about a pie recipe she'd inherited from her own mother, that she insisted on telling me in full detail because something in the conversation had turned to recipes, and Maria was a woman who, when she trusted you, gave you the whole thing. In the dining room, I could hear laughter. The kind of easy, well-fed, comfortable laughter of people who had never once worried about where they would sit. I ate my soup, and I listened to Maria's pie recipe, and I thought about Robert. I thought about something he had said to me in our 3rd year of marriage, when we had hit a difficult patch, and I had wanted to react from the wounded place, the hurt and angry place. Vivian, the best leverage is the kind no one knows you have. I thought about the documents in my attorney's office. I thought about how long I had been patient. And somewhere in that kitchen, with the soup warm in my hands, and the sound of Celeste's laughter coming through the wall, like a frequency I had decided to stop tuning into, I made a decision. I was done being patient. After dinner, I thanked Maria. I thanked the 2 young staff members by name. I had asked and remembered. I found my coat on the rack near the back door, where it had apparently been moved from the front closet where I'd left it, and I carried it to the foyer. The dinner party was breaking up in the slow, festive way of evenings that have gone well for most of the people who attended. Celeste stood at the center of the room, accepting compliments about the food and the house and the arrangement of the flowers. Ethan was shaking hands with the cufflink man. He saw me when I was almost to the front door. "Mom, wait, let me walk you out." "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said, and the word sweetheart was not sarcastic. It was simply true. He was my son. That didn't change. "I can manage. I'm sorry about the—" He looked back over his shoulder, an old reflex. "The seating thing, there was a mix-up. Ethan." I touched his arm, looked at him. "I know." He went quiet. We stood in the foyer for a moment, my son and I saw the thing he couldn't say written all over him. The sorry that lived too deep for his voice to find it. The guilt that had become such a permanent feature of his expression that he probably no longer recognized it as guilt. "Drive safe," I said. I went through the front door into the October night. I drove home on the Ridge Road with its construction and its detours, and I didn't sing this time. I thought instead. Carefully, methodically, the way Robert had taught me to think. Not from the hurt, but from the strategy. Not from what had been done to me, but from what I was going to do next. The house was full of dark when I got home. I didn't turn on all the lights. I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I let go cold, and I thought for 2 hours. Then I picked up the phone and called my attorney. His voicemail said to leave a message after the tone. I did. "Daniel," I said, "it's Vivian Mercer. I'd like to schedule a meeting this week if possible. There are some documents I think it's time to put into motion." I paused. "I'll explain when I see you." I set the phone down. Outside my window, the wind was coming in off the ridge the way it always did in October, in long, slow, searching currents, like something looking for a way through. I listened to it for a while. Then I went to bed. I slept, to my own surprise, very well. What I haven't told you yet, what I've been building toward, because good stories, like good strategies, require patience, is the fuller shape of what I had. In the 4 years since Robert's death, I had not been idle. Grief does one of 2 things to a person. It hollows you out and leaves you empty, or it clarifies you, burns away everything unnecessary, and shows you exactly what you're made of. I am made of the same thing Robert was made of. Watchfulness, patience, an understanding that the most important moves are always the quiet ones. The property portfolio. Robert and I had built together included 11 separate holdings across 3 counties, 3 commercial properties that generated monthly income, a land parcel in the north of Mill Haven that had, in the 4 years since Robert's death, tripled in assessed value due to a development project I'd anticipated when everyone else said the area was too far out, and the Harrow Hill estate, which I had not gifted but secured, and which remained in the legal and literal sense mine, the mortgage. Ethan and Celeste believed they were paying, the proud monthly assertion of their independence and their belonging in a certain tax bracket, was, in its structure, something they had perhaps not examined carefully enough. Because I had made the original contribution not as a gift but as a secured interest, the documents gave me specific rights. Rights that a good attorney had spent careful months making certain were airtight. I was the co-owner of record. I was the senior lion holder. And I had said nothing. For 3 years I had said nothing, had let Celeste hang her art and throw her parties and look at me like I was a problem she was patiently managing, and I had said nothing, because Robert was right. The best leverage is the kind no one knows you have, but I was done now with the quiet. Not from anger. I want to be precise about this, because it matters. What I was done with was not anger, but with its opposite. The terrible, costly patience of a woman who has decided, against all evidence, to keep waiting for people to be better than they are. I had waited for Celeste to become someone who could respect me. I had waited for Ethan to become someone who could protect his mother. Neither of those things was going to happen on their own. The invitation that arrived on a Tuesday had been intended as another small humiliation, another gentle pressure toward the exit. But what Celeste had done at that dinner, what she had done in front of all those people, with her champagne glass and her smile and her beautifully arranged flowers, was hand me something I hadn't quite had before. A reason. Not a legal reason. I'd had the legal reason for years. A moral reason. The clear, unambiguous, bone-deep certainty that I had been patient long enough, that I had absorbed enough, that the woman sitting in that kitchen with Maria Vasquez eating soup, while the dining room laughed, had nothing left to prove about her own forbearance. I had proven it for 7 years. I was done proving it. Well, the week after the dinner, I met with Daniel. Daniel Reeves had been my attorney since before Robert died, had helped us structure the portfolio, had been the one who drafted the documents for the Harrow Hill contribution. He was in his late 50s, a careful man who wore bow ties and had the quietly competent demeanor of someone who had been trusted with important things for long enough that he no longer needed to perform trustworthiness. He listened to what I told him. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. "You want to review the position," he said, when I'd finished. "I want to understand exactly what my options are," I said. "All of them." He nodded slowly. "I'll have everything ready by end of week." "And Daniel," I gathered my coat from the chair beside me, "I'd like you to prepare a document as well. A notice." I looked at him. "In case I need it." He understood. He always understood. "I'll draft it," he said. "But Vivian," he hesitated in the way of a man who cares about his client and is deciding whether to say the careful thing or the true thing. "Are you sure this is where you want to go?" I looked at him for a moment, at the bow tie, at the careful hands, at the framed photo on his desk of him and his wife and their 3 children at some lake somewhere, happy and sun-bright and ordinary. "Yes," I said, "I'm sure." I walked out of his office into the October afternoon, and the wind came off the ridge, and I was 63 years old, and I had been patient long enough. The dinner at Harrow Hill would be the last time I sat in that kitchen as a guest. The next time I walked through that door, it would be as what I had always been, the owner. Check. They built their lives on a foundation they didn't understand, and soon enough, the ground was going to move. Daniel's office smelled like old paper and coffee, the kind of smell that accumulates over decades of people bringing their worst problems through the door and leaving with something resembling a plan. I had been in that office 9 times since Robert died. Each time I left feeling slightly more solid than when I arrived. Daniel had that effect, not because he was warm, exactly, but because he was precise, and precision, when your life is coming apart at certain seams, is its own kind of comfort. He spread the documents across his desk on Thursday morning, and I sat across from him in the same chair I'd sat in for years, and we went through everything. The picture that emerged was cleaner than I'd even remembered. Robert had been meticulous, almost frighteningly so, and the structures he'd built into our financial arrangements had held exactly as he'd designed them. The Harrow Hill contribution was documented in triplicate. The secured interest was registered with the county. My position as co-owner of record was not a gray area, not a matter of interpretation. It was simply, flatly, legally true. "They've made 41 mortgage payments," Daniel said, sliding a sheet across the desk. "Each one has reduced the principal, which is to their credit. But your secured interest predates the mortgage. In terms of legal standing, you have priority." "And if I wanted to exercise that position," I said, "what would that look like?" I was quiet for a moment. He had his reading glasses on, and he looked at me over the top of them, the way he sometimes did when he was deciding how direct to be. "It would mean serving notice, giving them a defined period to either buy out your interest, which at current valuation would require significant liquidity, or vacate." The word vacate sat in the air between us. "How long would they have?" I asked. 60 days is standard. You could extend to 90 if you wanted to be generous." He paused. "Do you want to be generous?" I thought about the kitchen. about Maria Vasquez's careful kindness and the sound of laughter coming through the wall, about Ethan's face in the foyer and the words he hadn't found. I want to be fair, I said. Generous is a different thing. Daniel nodded like a man who had expected exactly that answer. I'll prepare 2 versions of the notice, one at 60 days, one at 90. You can decide which one to use when the time comes. And Daniel, I said, pulling on my gloves, I want a full accounting of the mortgage payments. Everyone. He looked at me. Why? Because I'd like to know what it cost them to live in my house, I said. And I'd like to have that number in writing before any conversation happens. He almost smiled. I'll have it ready by end of week. I walked out into November, because by now it was November. The October mildness had broken, and the cold had arrived with the particular authority of a season that doesn't negotiate, and I sat in my car for a moment before starting it. I was not angry. I want to keep saying that because I want you to understand that anger was not what was driving me. Anger is urgent and blinding, and it makes you move too fast. What I was feeling was something more like the sensation of a lock clicking open after a very long time, a kind of mechanical, satisfying certainty. I started the car. I drove home. I made a list, because Robert had taught me that before you make a move, you make a list. You account for everything. You don't leave anything to chance or to the heat of the moment. You decide what you're going to do before the moment arrives to do it, so that when it arrives, you're not deciding anymore. You're just executing. I made my list, and then I waited, because that's the hardest part, and I had gotten very good at hard parts. I didn't have to wait long. 3 weeks later, Celeste called me. She called on a Wednesday evening, which was unusual. Wednesday was not one of her contact days. Wednesday meant something had shifted, something had been decided, and she was deploying a new tactic. "Vivian," she said, and her voice had that particular warmth she activated for occasions when she needed something to look a certain way. Not genuine warmth. That would have required a different muscle entirely, one Celeste had either never developed or had long since stopped using with me. This was performance warmth. This was the vocal equivalent of the smile she used for photographs. "I wanted to call because I've been thinking about you." "Have you?" I said. "I have." A small pause, perfectly timed. "Ethan and I both have. We've been talking, and I hope you'll take this in the spirit it's meant, because we really do care about your well-being." Here it was. Here was the thing she'd been building toward. I had known it was coming. I had recognized it in the shape of her call, in the careful temperature of her voice, in the word well-being deployed in that particular way people deploy it when they mean something else entirely. "There's a facility," she said, "a senior living community, actually. It's beautiful, Vivian. It's not at all what you're picturing. More like a resort. They have activities and medical staff, and it's very social. I think you'd find your people there." "Your people." I breathed once, slowly, the way you breathe when you want to keep your voice even. "Your father, Ethan's father, left you quite comfortable, I know," she continued, and the slight stumble over father was the only moment of authentic awkwardness in the whole speech. "But at your age, living alone in that apartment, there are just concerns. And the community? I've already spoken to them. Actually, I took a tour last week." She had already taken a tour. She had taken a tour before calling me, before asking me, before having a single conversation with me about where I lived or how I lived or what I wanted. She had picked the place she intended to put me, and now she was calling to make it sound like kindness. "Celeste," I said. My voice was so calm it surprised even me. "I appreciate the thought." "Of course. But I'm not interested in moving." A beat of silence. "Vivian, I understand it might feel overwhelming to think about." "It doesn't feel overwhelming," I said. "I've thought about it extensively. My living situation is exactly what I want it to be. But the apartment..." She caught herself, recalibrated. "We just want you to be comfortable, to have people around you." "I have people around me," I said. "I have a full life, Celeste. I always have." The silence this time was different. There was something in it, a recalculation happening somewhere behind the warmth. She hadn't expected this version of me. She was used to the version that said lovely and absorbed things and went home quietly. "Well," she said at last, "perhaps we could all sit down together and talk about it. Ethan would love to see you. We could do a family dinner." "That sounds nice," I said. "Have Ethan call me." I hung up and sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment. She had taken a tour. I thought about that for the rest of the evening. The image of Celeste walking through a senior living facility, smiling at the staff, asking about the activities programs, probably photographing the nicest common area for some future presentation she was already planning in her head, while I was 40 minutes away in my apartment reading a library book, with absolutely no idea that someone had already decided what to do with me. That was the moment I stopped calling what she was doing unkindness. Unkindness is careless. What Celeste was doing was careful, deliberate, and escalating. She had moved from exclusion to active management. She was no longer content to push me out of the social landscape of my son's life. She was moving to push me out of geography entirely. And Ethan, I needed to sit with that part, because it cost me something to sit with it. Ethan had not called me himself. He had let his wife make this call. He had, in whatever conversation had led to Celeste picking up the phone, either actively agreed to this plan or passively failed to stop it, which in practice amounted to the same thing. I picked up a pen. I found the list I'd made. I added 2 words to the bottom of it, family dinner, because I understood now what was coming. Celeste was not done. The phone call had been a test, a first approach, a gentle probe to see if the territory would yield without resistance. When it didn't, she would escalate. She would arrange the family dinner she'd mentioned, and it would not be a small, quiet meal. It would be another performance, another gathering, another occasion engineered to apply pressure in front of witnesses. She needed witnesses. People like Celeste always needed witnesses, because witnesses created a version of events. And the version of events was what mattered most to her. The version of events where she was the caring daughter-in-law doing difficult but necessary things for the good of the family, and I was the stubborn, perhaps slightly faded older woman being gently guided toward her appropriate next chapter. She was going to try to do this publicly, to make it a fait accompli, to have enough people present that my refusal would look unreasonable, emotional, out of step. The thing she didn't know, the thing that kept me steady through those weeks, was that I had spent 31 years married to a man who taught me that the greatest advantage you can have is knowing what's coming before it arrives. I knew what was coming, and I was ready. 2 weeks after Celeste's call, Ethan finally phoned. It was a Sunday morning, the old pattern, the 40-minute window, and his voice had a quality I recognized from childhood, the voice of a boy who had done something wrong and was trying to decide whether to confess or deflect. "Mom, how are you?" "I'm well, sweetheart. How are you?" "Good. Good, yeah." A pause, the sound of a coffee maker in the background. "Listen, Celeste mentioned she talked to you about the—" He didn't finish the sentence. "The senior facility," I said, filling it in for him gently, without letting it sound like an accusation, even though it was. "Yeah, that—" Another pause. "I know it was probably— I know she should have— We should have talked to you together about it." "Yes," I said. "You should have." The word landed. I heard him absorb it. "Mom, it comes from a real place," he said, and his voice had shifted into something that was more recognizably him, the uncertainty, the genuineness that Celeste had been slowly coating over but hadn't managed to eliminate entirely. "I do worry about you alone in that apartment. The building's old and—" "Ethan." I said his name the way I had said it when he was 17 and making a bad decision and needed to hear me clearly. "I have lived alone for 4 years. I manage very well. My health is excellent. My finances are not your concern. And my choices about where I live are mine to make." Silence. "I know," he said quietly. "Do you?" A longer silence. "Yeah, I do." "Then let's not have this conversation again," I said. "And let's have the dinner your wife suggested. All 3 of us. No guests, no gathering. Just family." He said yes. He sounded relieved, which told me he'd been expecting something harder. He didn't understand yet that this conversation, the phone call, the acquiescence, the dinner plan, was not me standing down. It was me confirming what I already knew about the timeline. It was me watching the shape of what was coming and making sure I had all my documents in order before it arrived. The family dinner never happened, of course. Celeste called 2 days later to say they'd had something come up, a scheduling conflict, but she was thinking, and here her voice shifted back into that particular register. Wouldn't it be lovely to do something bigger? A proper family gathering? She had been thinking of inviting some relatives, some close friends, creating a real occasion. Something festive, she said. Something that felt like a celebration. Relatives. Close friends. A celebration. She was building the audience. I said that sounded lovely, and for the first time in 7 years, lovely was not a surrender. It was a trapdoor. It was me saying yes and meaning something she could not yet understand. I called Daniel that same afternoon. "It's time," I said. "Have everything ready." I spent the next week in Daniel's office, going through papers with a thoroughness that would have made Robert proud. Every document reviewed, every clause examined, every number verified. I was meticulous about it in a way that probably would have surprised people who knew me only as the quiet woman in the navy dress who ate soup in the kitchen and said lovely and went home without making a scene. Those people had been reading a performance. They'd been seeing what I allowed them to see. Because here's the thing about being underestimated. It has a cost, and it has a power. The cost is years of absorbing what you shouldn't have to absorb. The power is that when you finally move, no one sees it coming. They're still expecting the performance. They're still expecting the woman who retreats and apologizes and accepts. They're so certain of who you are that they cannot revise the picture even when the evidence is standing right in front of them. Celeste was certain she knew who I was. She was about to meet someone she had never seen before. The invitation for the family gathering arrived via email, which told me something, because Celeste was a woman who believed in printed invitations for events that mattered to her. An email meant either that this was casual or that she was moving faster than her usual organizational precision allowed. And either way, there was urgency behind it. The gathering was scheduled for a Saturday in December. The guest list, which Ethan forwarded to me without comment, included his 2 aunts from Robert's side, women I had always been close to, women who had known Robert, who remembered what our family had been before Celeste arranged it into its current shape, as well as Celeste's parents, her sister, and several of the same social acquaintances who had been present at the October dinner, the one where I had eaten in the kitchen. 22 people. She was bringing 22 people into the house for what she was framing as a holiday family celebration. I read the guest list 3 times. I thought about the aunts, Dorothea and Ruth, both in their 70s, women who had held my hands at Robert's funeral and brought me food for weeks afterward. Women who did not know what had happened at the October dinner because I had not told them. I had not told anyone, which had been a choice, a deliberate one, because I did not want to win through sympathy. I wanted to win through the simple, unambiguous authority of the facts. But having Dorothea and Ruth there, having people who knew me as Robert's wife, as the woman I had actually been for 31 years, not the version Celeste had been constructing, that changed the texture of what was coming. They would be witnesses to something they hadn't expected to see. I thought about calling them beforehand, considered it for a full evening, decided against it. What I had to show was complete on its own terms. It didn't require preparation or framing. It required only the documents, the moment, and whatever remained of my nerve. I RSVP'd, yes. I offered, in my reply email, to bring dessert. Celeste responded within the hour. Yes, that would be wonderful. How thoughtful of you. They were so looking forward to having me there. I made a pie. An apple pie from scratch, from a recipe I'd been making for 30 years, the one Robert had always asked for on his birthday. I made it carefully, the way I did everything now, with full attention, with intention, with no wasted motion. The night before the gathering, I laid out my clothes. The same navy dress, the same pearl earrings, different shoes. Not heels this time, but something with a flat sole and better grip, because I had learned from the October dinner that you should always be ready to stand for a long time. I set the pie on the counter to cool. I sat at my kitchen table. Outside, the December wind came off the ridge with serious intent, cold and clear, and no longer searching for a way through. It seemed to have found one. I looked at the pie. I thought about the documents in my bag. Daniel's careful work, the registered papers, the evidence of every mortgage payment made against a home that sat, legally and precisely, in my name. I thought about Celeste's certainty, the absolute unexamined assurance of a woman who had organized the world into categories and put me firmly at the bottom of hers, and had never once considered that the ground she was standing on had someone else's name on it. I thought about my son and the complexity of that, because he was both the person I was fighting for and the person I was fighting, and those two things could be true simultaneously, and they were. He was a man who had failed me in specific and serious ways, and he was also my son, and I contained both of those truths without letting either of them cancel the other. I would not destroy Ethan. That was not what this was. I was not going in there with a weapon. I was going in with the truth, which is a different thing entirely, even when it has the same immediate effect of breaking things apart. The pie cooled. The wind pressed against the windows. I sat with the quiet for a long time. Then I went to bed. Because tomorrow, December would begin its work. And so would I. The morning of the December gathering, I woke at 5:15 without an alarm. That had been happening more since Robert died. My body refusing to sleep past a certain point, as if it understood that rest was a luxury that required a particular kind of peace. And that particular kind of peace was something I was still working toward. I lay in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the buildings settle around me. The familiar creak of the hallway radiator, the sound of a car somewhere on the street below navigating frozen pavement. Then I got up. I made coffee. Strong, the way Robert had always made it, the way I'd complained about for 20 years, and then, after he was gone, had quietly adopted as my own. I stood at the kitchen window with the mug in both hands and watched the sky go from black to the particular gray-blue of a December dawn that isn't promising anything. The pie was on the counter where I'd left it, covered with a cloth. Beside my bag was the manila envelope Daniel had prepared, thick, sealed, my name written on the front in his precise handwriting. I had checked its contents twice the night before. I did not check them again. I knew what was inside. I had always known what was inside. What I was doing instead, standing at that window with my coffee, was something closer to accounting. Not of documents, but of years. Counting the cost of things the way you count the cost of things when you're about to settle a very long debt. 7 years of Sunday phone calls during the 40-minute window. 7 years of being introduced to Celeste's friends as Ethan's mother in a tone that managed to make the relationship sound like a clerical error. 7 years of holiday cards signed by both their names in Celeste's handwriting, not his. 7 years of watching my son perform the role of husband in a production where the role of son had been quietly written out. I finished my coffee. I washed the cup. I got dressed. The navy dress again. The pearl earrings. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a moment and looked at myself with the honesty that mirrors demand if you're willing to use them that way. 63 years old. Lines around my eyes that I had earned, every one of them. Gray threading through hair I had stopped fighting 5 years ago, when I decided that the energy required to pretend time wasn't passing was better spent on other things. A face that Robert had called beautiful right up until the last morning of his life, and which I understood now he had meant in the fullest, most accurate sense. Not young, not flawless, but readable. A face that had lived in it. I picked up my bag. I picked up the pie. I went to my car. The drive to Harrow Hill was 22 minutes. I did not listen to the jazz station this time. I drove in silence, which was its own kind of preparation. The way athletes go quiet before a competition, not from fear, but from focus. I needed to hear my own thinking clearly. By the time I turned through the iron gate, there were already 9 cars in the driveway. It was 11:40 in the morning, and the gathering wasn't formally until noon, which meant Celeste had either asked people to arrive early, or her social circle operated with the particular eagerness of people who didn't want to miss the thing they'd been told was important. Probably both. I sat in my car for 30 seconds. The same ritual as October, slightly different in quality. October had been apprehension. This was something else. Steadiness, maybe. The kind that comes not from certainty that everything will go well, but from certainty that you've done everything you could to prepare. I got out of the car carrying the pie. Ethan opened the door before I reached it, which surprised me. He must have been watching. He was in a dark green sweater and jeans, less formal than the October dinner, and the look on his face when he saw me was complicated in the way that only a person who loves someone badly and knows it can manage. Relief and guilt, yes, but something else underneath. Something that looked, if I wasn't imagining it, like the beginning of an awareness he hadn't quite allowed himself to have yet. Mom! He held the door. You made pie. Apple, I said. Your father's birthday pie. Something moved across his face at that. He knew why I'd made that one specifically. Ethan had always known things about me that he couldn't quite bring himself to act on. It was the central tragedy of him, really. Come in, he said. Everyone's in the living room. The house was full in a way. Harrow Hill liked to be full, all its surfaces showing off, the light doing the thing it did in winter when it came through the tall windows at that angle and made everything look more significant than it was. I could hear the assembled voices from the foyer, the layered conversational hum of 22 people who were warm and fed and not yet aware that the afternoon was going to be different from what they'd expected. I handed the pie to Ethan, who took it toward the kitchen. I kept my bag. I walked into the living room. The first thing I saw was Dorothea. She was 74 years old, Robert's older sister, a woman who had raised 4 children and buried a husband and still stood with the posture of someone who had decided long ago that the world didn't get to push her around. She was standing near the fireplace with a cup of something warm, and when she saw me, her face changed in the way that faces change when they see someone they genuinely love. Vivian. She came toward me and took both my hands. Hers were warm from the cup. You look well. So do you, I said, and meant it. Ruth somewhere. She looked around, spotted her sister-in-law across the room, talking to one of Celeste's relatives, and waved. Ruth, 71, sharp-eyed and practical, lifted her chin in acknowledgement and kept talking. Some things didn't require interruption. Dorothea held onto my hands for a moment longer than necessary. She was reading something in my face. She'd always been good at that. You all right? She asked, quiet enough that it was just for me. I will be, I said, which was not quite the same thing as yes, and she heard the difference, and she gave my hands one more squeeze before letting go. The next 20 minutes were the performance portion of the morning. I moved through the room with my bag over my shoulder, accepting greetings, making conversation, being what I had always been in these rooms, pleasant, contained, easy to underestimate. Celeste's parents were there, Gerald and Patricia Hargrove, a couple in their late 60s who had produced their daughter with the same care they brought to everything, which was considerable and largely aesthetic. Gerald shook my hand with the hearty warmth of a man who either didn't know or chose not to know what his daughter had been doing for 7 years. Patricia smiled with perfect positioning. Celeste's sister, Brooke, was someone I had spoken to exactly 4 times in 7 years. She had her sister's bone structure, but none of her precision. She was warmer, sloppier, more genuinely present. She hugged me when she saw me, which was unexpected enough that I took a moment to recover. It's so nice you could come, Brooke said. Celeste is thrilled you made it. I smiled and said nothing and moved on. Celeste herself materialized at my elbow about 10 minutes in, a hostess's timing calibrated to appear natural. She was in burgundy today, a wrap dress that suited her, and her hair was down. She looked, on the surface, like the version of herself she most wanted the world to see, gracious, festive, in her element. Vivian. The double-arm touch, the warm smile configuration. I'm so glad you came. You brought pie, Ethan told me. That's so sweet. I wanted to contribute, I said. Something flickered in her eyes at that word. Contribute. Too fast for anyone else to catch. But I wasn't anyone else. I had been studying Celeste for 7 years. I knew the microsecond of recalibration when a word landed close to something she was protecting. Of course, she said smoothly. We'll have it after lunch. She moved away. I watched her go. She worked the room for the next 30 minutes with the fluency of a politician in a friendly district, touching arms, laughing at the right moments, steering conversations with the gentle but absolute authority of a woman who understood that hosting was about control as much as hospitality. She was good at it. I had always acknowledged that. Celeste was genuinely, impressively good at the performance of warmth, which is a skill, even if it isn't the same thing as warmth itself. Lunch was served at 12:30. A catered spread, nothing as formal as the October dinner. This was the holiday casual version, which in Celeste's hands meant it was still precisely arranged but pretending not to be. Platters and boards, and the kind of abundance that announces itself without appearing to try. I found a seat at the large table beside Dorothea, with Ruth across from me. Ethan sat 3 seats down, next to one of Celeste's relatives, and he glanced at me once with that complicated expression before looking away. Celeste sat at the head of the table in the way that made it clear it was her table, and always would be, and she led the first 20 minutes of lunch conversation with the skill of a conductor who knows exactly where the piece is going. And I ate. And I talked to Dorothea about her youngest grandson, and I listened to Ruth argue mildly with Gerald Hargrove about some local zoning issue with the cheerful tenacity of a woman who had never once backed down from a factual disagreement. And I waited. Because I had learned, Robert had taught me, and 7 years of Celeste had reinforced it, that the person who acts last acts from the strongest position. Patience is not weakness. Patience is the understanding that timing is everything. and that the right moment is worth waiting for. The right moment arrived at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon. It arrived in the shape of Celeste, setting down her wine glass and looking around the table with an expression that I recognized as the shift from hostess to strategist, and saying, in a voice pitched to carry without appearing to raise itself, "Actually, since we're all here and it's family, there's something Ethan and I have been wanting to talk to everyone about." The table settled. The way tables settle when they sense something is changing. Ethan went very still. I put my fork down, quietly. "It's about Vivian," Celeste said, and she looked at me with an expression of such practiced tenderness that for a fraction of a second, if I hadn't known her, I might have believed it. "We've been worried about her living situation, about her being alone, and we found, well, it's really a wonderful place, Ethan. Tell her about it." Ethan was looking at the table. "Celeste, there's a beautiful community," she continued, overriding him with the ease of long practice, "about 30 minutes from here, called Clearwater Heights. It's not what you picture when you think of Celeste." Ethan's voice had an edge I hadn't heard from him in years. We didn't agree to, "We talked about this," she said, still pleasant, still warm, giving him a small look that I had seen her give him 100 times. The look that meant, "Not now, I'm handling this, let me handle this." And for a moment, one long terrible moment, I thought he was going to do what he had always done. Subside. Let her handle it. Retreat to the middle distance with his guilt. But he didn't. Not entirely. "We didn't agree to do it like this," he said, and there was something raw in his voice that the table heard. In front of everyone. Celeste's smile held. It was extraordinary to watch, the degree to which she could hold a smile while everything under it shifted. "I thought having family around would make it feel more—" "I'm fine," I said. The table went quiet. Not the conversational quiet of a pause. A real quiet. The kind that happens when something enters the room that has more weight than what was in it before. I looked at Celeste. Then I looked around the table, at Dorothea, whose eyes had narrowed, at Ruth, who had put down her own fork and was watching me with an alertness that I recognized from 30 years of knowing her, at Gerald Hargrove, who looked suddenly uncertain, at Brooke, who looked like she was beginning to understand that the afternoon was not what she'd been told it would be, at Ethan, whose face had gone the color of someone who has realized, too late, how large a thing has been set in motion. "I'm not moving to Clearwater Heights," I said. Calm. Level. The voice I'd used with Daniel, with the October dinner, with 31 years of decisions made from the steady place. "I appreciate the concern. I know it's meant." And here I paused deliberately, to look like care. Celeste's smile shifted. The temperature in the room shifted with it. "Vivian, that's not fair." "What isn't fair," I said, still quiet, "is organizing a gathering of 22 people to pressure a 63-year-old woman into giving up her independence. What isn't fair is calling this a family celebration and using it as a venue for something you've been planning since October." The silence became absolute. Celeste's eyes had gone from warm to cold so fast it was almost admirable. "I don't know what you think is happening here." "I know exactly what's happening here," I said. "I've known for 3 weeks, and I've been patient." The word came out with an edge that surprised even me. "I have been very patient for a very long time." I reached into my bag. I want to tell you what it felt like to put my hand into that bag and feel the manila envelope. Cool, solid, real. 7 years of careful waiting contained in a document that had always been there, always been legal, always been true. Robert's voice in my head, steady and clear. "The best leverage is the kind no one knows you have." I set the envelope on the table. Not with force. I didn't slam it. I simply placed it there, in the center of everything, where it could be seen. "What is that?" Celeste's voice had a quality I had never heard from her before. Not anger. She was too controlled for immediate anger. Something underneath anger. Something that lived in the gap between certainty and its opposite. "Documents," I said, "regarding this property." Ethan made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "This house," I said, looking around the table, looking at Dorothea and Ruth and Gerald Hargrove and Celeste's carefully assembled social witnesses, was purchased with a contribution from me, not a gift, a secured interest, structured legally and registered with the county. I am a co-owner of record of Harrow Hill Estate. I let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. I have been a co-owner of record for 3 years. The sound that went around the table was not a gasp. It was something quieter and more complicated, The sound of 22 people's understanding of a situation rapidly, simultaneously restructuring itself. That's, Celeste started. Her voice cracked on the first word. She recovered, but the crack had been heard. That's not... Ethan, tell me what, I said, and I looked at my son, and for the first time in years I was not asking him to be better than he was. I was simply showing him, clearly and without mercy, what the truth looked like. Ethan had both hands flat on the table. He was looking at the envelope. His face was doing something painful and necessary, the expression of a man having a reckoning with himself in public, which is possibly the hardest kind to have. The documents are registered, Mum, I said to the room. Not to hurt them. I want that to be clear, because I've had to be clear with myself about the difference, and it matters. I was not there for revenge. I was there because I had been left without any other option, and because sometimes the only way to make the truth visible is to put it on the table in front of witnesses. Everything is in order. My attorney has copies. The county has copies. I looked at Celeste. You have been living in my home for 3 years. Celeste's face had done something I had never seen it do in 7 years. It had lost its architecture. The performance, the warmth, the management, the absolute conviction of her own authority had dropped, and what was underneath was just a person. Frightened and caught and very, very aware that 22 people were looking at her. I didn't... She stopped, started again. Ethan, did you know about this? Ethan looked up from the table. He looked at his wife, and then he looked at me, and the thing that crossed his face in that moment. I won't claim it was everything I needed from him, because it wasn't. It was only a beginning, but it was real. Yes, he said quietly. I knew. The table absorbed that. Dorothea beside me put her hand over mine. It was warm and dry and certain. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Celeste pushed back her chair and stood. She was still composed. She would always, I thought, be composed in certain ways, because some things go too deep to be entirely dismantled in a single moment. But the composure was different now, hollow in a way that hadn't been visible before, the way a wall looks different once you know there's nothing behind it. Excuse me, she said, to no one and everyone, and walked toward the hallway with the particular stiffness of someone controlling very hard not to run. The room sat in silence. Ruth cleared her throat. Gerald Hargrove was looking at his hands. Brooke was looking at the doorway where her sister had disappeared with an expression that suggested she was rearranging several years of information. Ethan hadn't moved. Ethan, I said, and my voice, to my own surprise, was not cold, not triumphant. It was just tired, in the honest way of something that has been carrying too much for too long and is setting part of it down. I need you to hear me. He looked up. I didn't come here to destroy you, I said. I came here because I was left with no other choice, because the woman you married has been working, for 7 years, to remove me from your life entirely, and you let her. And I absorbed every bit of it until I couldn't anymore. My voice stayed even. I was proud of my voice again. This is not the end of us, but it is the end of this arrangement. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. Mom, I'm sorry. 2 words. 2 small, inadequate words for 7 years. And yet, I knew Robert well enough to know that where things begin matters less than whether they actually begin. It was something, from a man who had been a long time finding even that. I know you are, I said. I picked up the envelope. I looked at the faces around the table. Robert's sisters, who had known me as a younger woman, the Hargroves, who were still processing, the social acquaintances who had come for a holiday gathering and were getting something considerably more significant. I thought briefly of Maria Vasquez, 40 minutes away, who had served me soup with more dignity than I'd received at this table, and I hoped she was having a good December. Then I stood up, straightened my dress, and picked up my bag. I had said what needed to be said. The documents were real. The position was established. What happened next would require lawyers and conversations and a great deal of uncomfortable honesty from people who had grown accustomed to comfortable dishonesty. But the table had turned. I had turned it. And I walked out of the dining room with my bag on my shoulder and my pearls at my ears, and 31 years of Robert Mercer's voice telling me that leverage is the kind no one knows you have, right up until the moment you don't need to hide it anymore. I drove home in the same silence I'd driven there in, but it was a different silence now, fuller. The way a room feels different after a window has been opened, Same space, different air. My hands were steady on the wheel. I noticed that the way you notice physical things when your mind is still processing something too large to hold all at once. Steady hands, even breathing. The ridge road unspooling ahead of me in the winter gray, familiar and ordinary, and somehow more itself than usual, the way ordinary things sometimes become more vivid after something significant has happened nearby. I didn't cry until I got home. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. I had held myself together with both hands through the gathering, through the dining room, through Ethan's two-word apology and Celeste's retreating back, and Dorothea's warm hand over mine and the drive home. I had held because I needed to hold, and when I didn't need to anymore, I sat down at my kitchen table in my navy dress with my bag still on my shoulder, and I cried for about 12 minutes. Not from sadness, exactly. Or not only from sadness. It was the kind of crying that is really just the body releasing pressure. It has been holding for a very long time, the physical consequence of 7 years compressing into a single afternoon, and then finally being allowed to decompress. Robert would have recognized it. He used to say I stored things like a pressure cooker, and eventually something had to give. He wasn't wrong. He rarely was. About me. After 12 minutes, I stopped. I washed my face. I put the kettle on. I sat back down at the table and I thought about what came next, because what comes next is always the harder question. The moment after the confrontation, the morning after the reckoning, the part nobody talks about because it's less dramatic and more difficult than everything that preceded it. My phone rang at 7 p.m. Dorothea. Are you home? She asked. No preamble. Dorothea had never believed in preamble. Yes. Are you all right? I thought about it honestly, the way Dorothea deserved. I think so. I will be. Good. A pause. Ruth and I want you to know, we had no idea about the October dinner, about any of it. Ethan never said a word, and we should have checked on you more. I should have. Dorothea, don't tell me it's fine, she said, sharp and immediate. I know you. You were going to say it's fine. I almost smiled. I was. It isn't fine. It was a long time of not fine. Her voice had shifted into something that was close to angry, the kind of anger that comes from love that has been kept in the dark and is only now understanding what it was kept from. What are you going to do with the house? Serve notice, I said. Formally. Give them 60 days. A short silence. And Ethan? This was the question I had been sitting with since I left Harrow Hill. The one that didn't have a clean answer, and wouldn't for a long time, and I had to be at peace with that uncertainty rather than forcing it into a shape it wasn't ready to hold. I don't know yet, I said. He's my son. That part doesn't go away. I paused. But what he allowed to happen doesn't go away either. Both things are true. Yes, Dorothea said quietly. That's honest. We talked for another 20 minutes, about Robert, briefly, which we hadn't done together in a while because grief shared with people who shared the loss is a different thing from grief held alone. Then she said goodnight and told me to call if I needed anything, and meant it in the specific way of someone who would actually answer. I sat with the quiet after she hung up. The apartment was warm. The radiator was doing its thing. Outside, December was continuing its work, cold and still and unimpressed with the drama of human lives. I thought about Celeste. I had not spoken to her directly after I stood from the table. She had not come back into the dining room. I had heard her footsteps somewhere above, in the upper floor, and Ethan had slipped out at some point after my announcement, and I assumed gone to find her. The remaining guests had absorbed what had happened in different ways. Dorothea and Ruth, with tight-jawed solidarity, Gerald and Patricia Hargrove, with the stunned quiet of people receiving information about their daughter. They were not prepared to receive. Brooke with an expression that suggested she was undertaking a significant personal inventory. I had not made a speech. I had not explained further or expanded or given anyone a framework for understanding what they'd witnessed. I had simply said what was true and then left. Because the truth doesn't require decoration, and I was done performing for rooms that hadn't earned it. But Celeste was still a person I had to think about. Not with sympathy. I was not capable of sympathy for her in those hours. And I think the honest thing is to admit that rather than pretend to a grace, I wasn't feeling. But with accuracy. Because accuracy matters when you're deciding what to do next, and you need to understand the person you're dealing with. Celeste Hargrove was not, at her center, a villain. I had thought of her that way, in my harder moments, and I understood why. But what she actually was, I had come to believe, was something more ordinary and more dangerous. A person who had built her entire identity on the belief that she deserved more than she had, that the distance between where she was and where she should be was caused by obstacles rather than by the limits of who she was, and that removing those obstacles was simply good management. I had been an obstacle. Ethan's attachment to me, his guilt about me, his inconvenient love for me, all of it had been, to Celeste, a project to be managed. Not because she was evil, because she genuinely could not see past the architecture of her own ambition far enough to understand what she was doing to a person. That didn't make it acceptable, but it made it comprehensible. And comprehensible things can be dealt with. Daniel called me Monday morning, 9 o'clock exactly. He was a man of punctual habits. I heard from their attorney, he said. I set down my coffee. That was fast. Celeste retained someone Sunday afternoon, apparently. A pause that contained, for Daniel, an unusual amount of what I can only describe as dry satisfaction. They're contesting the secured interest on the grounds that the original contribution was intended as a gift. They signed documents saying otherwise, I said. Yes, Daniel said. They did, which is why I expect this particular argument will have a short life. But we should be prepared for it to take some time. They'll want to delay. How long? If they push it, and I think they will, we're looking at several months before any notice could be enforced. They know that. They're buying time. Another pause. How are you holding up? It was an uncharacteristic question from Daniel, who operated in the realm of facts and documents and whose emotional range in professional settings ran from neutral to professionally sympathetic. I appreciated the departure. I'm holding, I said. That's enough for now. It is, he said, with the conviction of a man who had seen enough legal battles to know that holding was sometimes the whole job. I'll file our response this week. And Vivian, their argument is weak. I want you to know that. I know, I said. Robert didn't do weak documents. No, Daniel said. He really didn't. The months that followed were not cinematic. I want to be clear about that because the temptation in telling a story like this is to make the aftermath as dramatic as the confrontation. And the truth is that aftermath is mostly paperwork and phone calls and the slow, grinding mechanics of institutional processes that don't care about anyone's emotional arc. Celeste's attorney filed the contest in December. Daniel responded in January. There were hearings, briefly, in February. I did not attend them. Daniel represented my position, and I stayed home and read and cooked and called Dorothea on Sundays in the way I had always wanted to without feeling like I had to hide it from anyone. In March, the contest was dismissed. The judge, a practical woman in her 60s who had apparently read the original documents with the thoroughness they deserved, issued a ruling that I was told was fairly terse in its conclusion. The secured interest was valid, the original documentation was unambiguous, and the claim of gift intent was not supported by any of the evidence presented. Daniel called me within an hour of the ruling. It's done, he said. You can serve the notice. I was in my kitchen when he called. Standing at the window again, same ridge in the distance, with the same bare-branched trees that had been there in October and November and December, now beginning, in the March light, to suggest the faint possibility of something coming back. 60 days, I said. 60 days, Daniel confirmed. Daniel, I hung up and stood there for a while. Not celebrating. That didn't feel right, and wouldn't have, even if I'd been the celebrating type. What I felt was closer to the feeling at the end of a very long physical effort, the moment when you set something heavy down, and your muscles remember what it was to not carry it. Relief with an ache in it. Resolution with the understanding that resolution is never quite as clean as you imagined it would be when you were still in the middle of everything. The notice was served on a Thursday. I did not deliver it myself. Daniel sent a process server, which was the appropriate and legally sound way to do it, and also the way that didn't require me to stand on the doorstep of Harrow Hill and watch Celeste's face when she read what she was holding. I had seen enough of Celeste's face. I didn't need that particular image to carry forward with me. Ethan called me that same Thursday evening. I had been expecting it, not with dread exactly, but with the particular bracing quality of expecting something you know is necessary and hard. Mom. His voice was different from every other time he'd called me in recent memory. Stripped of the managed quality, the careful distance. He sounded the way he'd sounded when he was 22 and calling me from his first apartment in a city he didn't know yet, trying to figure out how to be a person, raw and uncertain and real. I got the notice. I know. He stopped. Started again. I'm not going to fight it. I want you to know that. I told Celeste, I'm not fighting it. I absorbed this. What did she say? A short, complicated pause. She said a lot of things. His voice was careful there, in a way that told me the things Celeste had said were not things she would want repeated. He stopped again. It's been a hard few months, Mom. Yes, I said. I imagine it has been. She's talking about her parents' place in Scottsdale, going there for a while. He said it in the tone of a man who is not sure yet whether the person he's describing is leaving or giving him an ultimatum or both. I don't know what happens after that. I didn't fill that silence with comfort. Not because I didn't feel anything for him. I did. I felt plenty. It was complicated and aching and real. But because filling his silences with comfort had been something I'd done for too long. And sometimes the honest response to someone sitting in the consequences of their choices is to let them sit there long enough to actually feel the floor. What do you want to happen? I asked. A long pause. His voice broke slightly, repaired itself. I want to not have spent 7 years being someone I'm ashamed of. Ethan. I sat down at my kitchen table. The same table I always came back to, it seemed, for all the conversations that mattered. You can't undo 7 years, neither of us can. But the person who says that out loud to his mother, that person is someone I recognize. I was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. I don't know how to fix it. You don't fix it, I said. You build something different, slowly, and you show up for it even when it's uncomfortable. I paused. Can you do that? I want to try, he said. Which was not the same as yes, and he knew it, and I knew it, and the honesty of the distinction was itself a kind of beginning. That's enough for now, I said. We talked for another 20 minutes about ordinary things, halting, careful, the conversational equivalent of testing ice to see if it will hold weight. His job. A book he'd been reading. The Ridge Road construction that had apparently still not been finished. Small, true things that didn't demand anything from either of us except presence. When I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a while. The March light was doing something through the window. Longer now, more angled, the kind of light that is only possible in early spring when the world is still winter bare, but the quality of the sun has shifted just enough to remind you that shift is possible. 3 weeks after the notice was served, I drove to Harrow Hill. Not because I had to. The legal process was running on its own timeline and didn't require my presence. I drove there because the house was mine, and I had not stood inside it as its owner, fully, consciously, without performance or pretense, and I needed to do that before the 60 days ran out and the next phase began. The gate was unlocked. I had expected to ring the bell. Instead, the gate stood open as if it had been expecting me, which was coincidence but felt like something else. I pulled through and parked in the driveway, which had only one car in it, Ethan's. The silver Mercedes that had been Celeste's was gone. Had been gone, I would learn later, for nearly 2 weeks. She had gone to Scottsdale. She had packed 3 large suitcases and driven herself to the airport and not asked Ethan to come. He answered the door himself. He looked like a man who had been sleeping badly and not eating quite enough and spending a lot of time in his own head, which was accurate. He was in old jeans and a sweatshirt, not the careful casual of his Celeste-era weekend presentation, but actual comfortable clothes worn without intention, which was the first time in years I'd seen him dress for himself rather than for the image. I wasn't sure you were coming, he said. I wasn't sure either, I said. Can I come in? He stepped back. I walked through the foyer, past the wall of photographs, which I noticed had a different quality now, several frames slightly tilted, one bare nail where something had been removed, the arrangement beginning to show the gaps of a life that was being partially dismantled. Into the living room, which was quieter and less curated than I'd ever seen it. A half-read book on the coffee table, a coffee cup that hadn't been cleared. The specific, particular silence of a house from which one of its organizing presences has been removed. I walked to the window, the tall one that looked out over the back garden, the stone terrace where Celeste had hosted her photographed parties, the bare winter garden that was beginning, at its edges, to show the first faint suggestion of what it would become in spring. I stood there for a moment, just stood, feeling the floor under my feet, the light on my face, the specific solidity of a place that had been mine all along without my ever having stood in it this way. "Mom," Ethan said from somewhere behind me. "Yes," I said, not turning yet. "I want to say something, and I need you to just let me say it without me trying to explain it away or qualify it." I turned then. I was standing in the middle of the living room with his hands at his sides, and he looked younger than he had in years. Not because anything about him was younger, but because the management had dropped away, and what was underneath was closer to the boy I'd raised. The one who had failed out of his first semester and called me from a city he didn't know yet, and said, "I don't know what I'm doing, Mom." That boy. "She was wrong," he said. "The October dinner was wrong. The phone call about the facility was wrong. The way she spoke about you was wrong." He paused. And I let it happen. For years I let it happen, and told myself I was keeping the peace. And the truth is, I was afraid of her and afraid of losing her, and I made you pay for that fear, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry in a way I don't have good enough words for. The room was very still. I looked at my son, at the lines on his face that were his father's lines, arranged in his father's specific way, at the hands he had at his sides, Robert's hands, the same broad shape. "I know," I said. Is that enough?" "Not yet," I said. Honest, because he deserved honest. "But it's a beginning." I paused. "And I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens with the house, whatever happens with you and Celeste, I am your mother. That part of this story doesn't have an ending." He exhaled, a long, rough sound like something releasing. We stood there for a moment in the living room of the house I owned, my son and I, with the March light coming through the tall windows and the bare garden outside beginning its slow return to something living, and we didn't say anything else for a while. Sometimes the most important thing two people can do is simply occupy the same space without requiring anything from it, without performing or managing or saying the thing they think they're supposed to say. Sometimes the realest communication is just, "I am here and you are here and we are not leaving." I stayed for 2 hours. Ethan made coffee, badly, it turned out, which was somehow deeply comforting, and we sat at the kitchen table and talked about things that mattered and things that didn't, and some things that were somewhere in between. He asked about the house, what I planned to do with it, whether I'd sell it or move in or something else. I told him I hadn't decided yet, which was true. He nodded like a man who was learning, slowly and at some cost, that not all questions have answers that can be delivered on schedule. When I left, he walked me to my car. The December cold had given way to March cold, which is different, less certain of itself, already compromised by the direction things are moving. "Can I call you Sunday?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Call Sunday." I drove home on the Ridge Road. The construction was still not finished. Those orange cones had become a permanent feature of my commute to and from that part of my life. A constant reminder that some things take longer than anyone plans for and require more detours than anyone anticipates. I drove through the last of the detour and came out onto the clear road, and the late afternoon light was doing something extraordinary with the ridge, turning the bare trees to copper and old gold, every branch distinct and lit from within it seemed, the whole hillside burning quietly with the particular beauty of things that are not yet renewed but are no longer quite as broken as they were. I pulled over. Just for a moment, just to look. Robert had loved that ridge in late afternoon. He had said once that the trees looked like they were arguing with the sky, all those bare branches reaching up. I had laughed at him, and he had laughed back, and we had been young enough then that the conversation had gone on into the evening and become something else entirely. I sat with that memory for a while. Sat with him, the way I sometimes did when the light was right, and the day had been the kind of day that required witness. Then I drove home. The eviction notice had 60 days on it. There was paperwork still to process, arrangements to be made, a future to be configured from the pieces of the present. None of it was finished. None of it was clean. But the table had been turned. The truth had been said aloud in a room full of witnesses. My son had used the word sorry like he meant it, imperfectly, and with the full weight of what it cost him. And I was driving home in the late afternoon light to an apartment that was mine, to a life that was mine, to a self that I had not surrendered even when every pressure around me had been designed to make surrender feel like the only option. Dignity, I had learned, was not something anyone could grant you. It was also not something anyone could permanently take. It lived in what you chose, again and again, when the choice was hard. It lived in the steady hands and the even voice and the manila envelope placed without force on a table in a house you had always owned. It lived in the decision, made over and over and over, to be exactly who you were. The 60 days passed the way all significant waiting periods pass, unevenly. Some days moved like normal days, full of ordinary things that had nothing to do with iron gates and legal notices and the slow unwinding of a 7-year arrangement. Other days had a thickness to them, a weight, as if time itself understood it was carrying something and was being careful about it. Celeste did not return from Scottsdale. I learned this in pieces, the way you learn most things about a situation you're adjacent to, but not inside. Ethan mentioned it once on a Sunday call in early April, briefly and without elaboration. She's staying at her parents' for a while, and I didn't push because pushing wasn't my role anymore, if it had ever been. Dorothea mentioned it a week later with the particular careful neutrality of a woman who had strong opinions she was choosing to keep to herself. Brooke, Celeste's sister, sent me a short email in mid-April that I read 3 times before I understood what it was. An apology. Not for her sister exactly, for not having seen, for the years of family gatherings where Brooke had been present and had not looked closely enough to notice what was happening to me in the margins. I think I told myself it wasn't my business, she wrote. That's not the same as it not being wrong. I'm sorry, Vivian. I wrote back and told her I appreciated it. I meant that. It cost her something to send it, and things that cost something deserve to be received properly. The 60 days ended on a Thursday in April. I had been prepared for this day for months, had known its date the way you know the date of something significant and irreversible. But knowing something is coming doesn't mean you're entirely ready for it when it arrives. I was in my apartment at 8 in the morning, dressed and sitting at the kitchen table when Daniel called. It's clean, he said. Ethan surrendered his occupancy yesterday. The property is fully yours as of today. I sat with that sentence for a moment. Fully yours. As if it hadn't always been, in every way that mattered except the one that was now, finally, also resolved. Thank you, Daniel, I said. What are you going to do with it? He asked. Same question Ethan had asked me in March, standing in the living room with his bad coffee and his genuine uncertainty. I'm going to move in, I said. A pause. Really? It's a good house, I said. Robert would have liked it. He always said a house should be used, not just owned. Daniel made a sound that was almost a laugh, a rare thing from him, and I valued it accordingly. I'll have the transfer documents ready by end of week. I hung up and looked around my apartment. The small rooms, the rattling windows, the library book on the table, and the chamomile tea, and the life I had built inside this modest square footage after Robert died, after I had retreated into smallness because grief has its own way of shrinking your sense of what you deserve. I had not been unhappy here, but I had been smaller here than I needed to be, and I understood now that some of that smallness had been chosen, and some of it had been imposed, and learning the difference between those two things was one of the quieter lessons of the past year. I was done being small. I called Ethan that evening. He picked up on the second ring. The transfer finalized today, I said. I know. His voice was steady. Not without pain. There was pain in it, the specific kind that comes from watching a consequence you earned arrive exactly as predicted, but steady beneath it. I signed the last documents yesterday. Are you all right? He was quiet for a moment. I'm working on it. A pause. Where are you going to stay? In the house, I mean. I'm going to move in, I said. In a few weeks, once I figure out what stays and what goes. Another pause. I could hear him processing this. The image of me in Harrow Hill, in the rooms where he and Celeste had built their version of a life. I didn't rush him through it. The garden needs work, he said finally. The back terrace. The stone's cracked in a few places, and there's a section of the garden wall that's been going since last fall. It was such a specific, practical Ethan thing to say. His father's son in that precise moment. The man who, when emotional weight became too much, turned to the concrete and the fixable. I felt something loosen in my chest. Do you want to come fix it? I asked. A long pause. Yeah, he said quietly. I do. We made a plan for the following Saturday. Not a big plan. Not a reconciliation ceremony, not a dramatic gesture. Just a plan for Ethan to come to the house with a bag of mortar and work on the cracked terrace while I figured out what I was going to do with the back bedroom. Ordinary, imperfect, human. It was enough. It was more than enough. The weeks between that phone call and my move into Harrow Hill were some of the busiest I'd had in years, sorting and packing and deciding. The ancient, difficult arithmetic of a life being reorganized. I kept almost nothing from the apartment that wasn't personal, wasn't mine in the deepest sense. Books, photographs, Robert's old writing desk that had followed me through 3 moves and was not going to stop following me now. The quilt his mother had made. My kitchen things, because I cooked with the specific attachment of someone who believes that tools used for 30 years have a memory in them that shouldn't be abandoned. What I left behind. The sense that my life had to fit into a certain modest dimension to be appropriate. The habit of saying lovely when I meant something harder. The belief, which I had held longer than I was proud of, that wanting space and dignity and the full acknowledgement of who I was amounted to asking for too much. Those things I left in the apartment when I handed over the keys. I moved into Harrow Hill on the first Saturday in May. Ethan was there. He had come the previous weekend to fix the terrace, and fixed it properly, working with a methodical patience that reminded me so acutely of Robert that I had to leave the garden for 20 minutes and find something to do in another room. He had come again this Saturday to help me move boxes, which he did without being asked to, showing up with 2 friends from work and a truck rented for the day. And I watched my son carry my boxes through the front door of the house his mother owned, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Gratitude. Not for the carrying exactly, but for the showing up. For choosing to be present in a moment that was complicated for him, because the complicated moments are the ones that matter. By afternoon, the main rooms had the beginning of a shape. Not my shape yet. That would take months. The slow accumulation of a life settling into a space. The particular arrangement of things that tells you a house has become a home, but a beginning. Robert's desk under the tall window in the study, where the light came in exactly right. My books in the built-in shelves in the living room, replacing the art-directed arrangement of objects that had been Celeste's, and which Ethan had quietly cleared before I arrived. My kitchen things in the kitchen that had been designed for showing off, and would now, for the first time, be used daily by someone who actually cooked. At some point in the late afternoon, Ethan and his friends went for food. Sandwiches from a place in town. A practical and inelegant dinner eaten standing in my half-arranged kitchen. Ethan's friends were good people, I thought, watching them. Easy in their bodies, not performing anything, treating the occasion with the normalcy that it deserved. They didn't ask about the history of the house. They asked if I wanted mustard on my sandwich. I did. After they left, Ethan stayed. We sat in the living room as the May evening came through the tall windows. Not the winter gray I'd been looking at for months, but actual evening light, the long kind that only comes in spring and early summer when the day can't quite bring itself to end. He had a beer. I had tea. We sat in the particular quiet of 2 people who have said most of what needed saying and are now learning how to exist in the aftermath. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes? Did you always know that you were going to do what you did at the December dinner? Did you plan it from the beginning?" I thought about how to answer honestly. "I planned it from the October dinner," I said, after she sat me in the kitchen with the catering staff. He closed his eyes briefly. The kind of closing that isn't sleepiness, but the involuntary response to something you wish you could unsee. I should have stopped that. "Yes," I said. "You should have." He opened his eyes. "I know. I'm not asking you to say it's okay." "Good," I said, because it wasn't. We sat with that, just sat with it, without trying to paper over it or rush past it. That was new between us, the willingness to let the hard thing be hard without immediately trying to fix the feeling. I didn't know if it would last. Ethan was still the man he'd been, with the weaknesses he'd always had, and rebuilding something structural takes longer than a season and doesn't go in a straight line. I knew that. I had not rewritten the story of my son into something simpler than he was, but he was here. On a Saturday evening, in a house that had caused both of us considerable pain, choosing to be present with me in the aftermath of it. That was real. That was not nothing. "She called me last week," he said. "Celeste." I waited. "She wants to know if we're going to try to work it out." He was looking at his hands. "She said she's been doing therapy in Scottsdale." "What are you going to do?" A long pause. "I don't know yet." He looked up. "Is that a terrible answer?" No, I said. It's an honest one. Those aren't always the same thing, but in this case, they happen to be. He nodded slowly. She's not. I know you think she's a particular kind of person, and a lot of what she did was wrong. I'm not arguing that. But she's also. He stopped, found the words. She was scared too, I think, of not being enough, of losing things. It came out in the worst possible way, and she hurt people who didn't deserve it, but I don't think she's. He shook his head. I don't know what I think. I sat with this. The honest, complicated loyalty of a man trying to hold multiple truths at once, which is harder than people give credit for. I'm not going to tell you what to do about your marriage, I said. That's yours. What I will tell you is this. Whoever you choose to be in it, be that person honestly. Don't disappear again. Don't let someone else's needs become so loud you can't hear your own. And I paused. Don't let anyone make you choose between the people you love. Anyone who requires that of you is asking for something they don't have the right to ask. He was quiet for a long time after that. I heard you, he said finally. Simple. Direct. The way his father used to speak when he'd listened to something all the way through. We sat until the spring evening finally gave up and went dark. And then Ethan left. And I was alone in my house for the first time. I stood in the middle of the living room after I heard his car pull away. Just stood. The house was quiet around me. The specific quiet of a space that is full of the work of the day, of boxes half opened, and furniture newly placed, and rooms that haven't settled yet into what they'll become. I walked to the tall window. The back garden was just visible in the darkness. The stone terrace with its newly filled cracks. The garden wall. The beds that had been Celeste's project and would be mine now, in whatever form I decided to make them. The shape of things coming back in the May dark. I thought about Robert. I did this less desperately than I had in the first years. The grief had not disappeared but had changed its shape, become less like drowning and more like carrying, which is still heavy, but at least lets you move. I thought about what he would have said about this house, about this year, about the choices I had made. He would have said, "You waited longer than you should have." And he would have been right. I had absorbed more than I should have allowed, told myself more lovelies than any person should say, and waited with a patience that had more fear in it than I'd admitted at the time. Fear of damaging Ethan's marriage, fear of being the difficult mother-in-law, fear of confirming what Celeste wanted everyone to believe about me. Fear dresses itself as patience sometimes. I had learned that the hard way. But then he would have said, and I knew this as clearly as if he were standing beside me, "But you got there, Viv. You got there. I had gotten there. Not perfectly. Not without cost. Not without the 12 minutes of crying at my kitchen table and the months of paperwork and the complicated, ongoing, unfinished work of rebuilding something with my son that had been allowed to deteriorate for years. None of it had been clean or tidy or the way you'd write it if you were writing a story where everything worked out the way it should. But I was standing in my house, in the house that had always been mine. At 63 years old, with Robert's desk under the tall window and my books in the shelves and the spring night outside, and no one in the world who could tell me where to sit. I had claimed this, not been given it. I want to be clear about that distinction, because it is the most important thing I know. Dignity is never given. It isn't handed to you by the people who wronged you when they finally have a change of heart, or granted by a judge, or produced by a legal document, as satisfying as that document was to place on a table. Dignity is what happens when you decide, in the face of every pressure to make yourself smaller, every voice telling you your needs don't matter, every room that has no chair for you, you decide to take up the space that is yours. It starts inside you before it ever changes anything outside you. That's the part no one tells you. That's the part I wish someone had told me sooner, though I'm not sure I would have been ready to hear it until I was. I was 60 years old when Robert died, and the world looked at me and saw a widow in a modest apartment with a library book, and made all its quiet assumptions. And I had let it for a while because grief is a country with no clear borders, and you can wander in it for a long time without realizing how far from yourself you've gotten. But I had come back. Not all at once. Never all at once. In small returns. The first time I checked a document instead of trusting someone else's account of it. The first time I said, "I'm not moving," and felt the ground hold under the words. The morning I called Daniel and said, "It's time," and felt the rightness of it like a key turning in a lock. And here. Now. In this house, in this light, At 63 years old, with my whole life arranged exactly as I had chosen to arrange it, I found the kitchen by instinct. That was already happening. The house beginning to map itself onto my body, the way houses do when they start to become yours. I put the kettle on. I found my mug in one of the boxes I'd opened earlier, the one I'd used every morning for 11 years, chipped on the handle from when I'd knocked it against the tap one winter, and Robert had said he'd replace it, and I'd said I liked it better chipped. Because I did. Because things that have been used and have survived their damage are not diminished by it. I made my tea. I carried it to the window in the kitchen, a different window from my apartment window, larger, looking out over the side garden rather than the ridge, but catching the same night sky, the same stars that had always been there, whether I was looking at them or not. Dorothea called at 9. She had a sense for timing that I had always found remarkable in a woman who claimed to have no particular intuition. "First night," she said when I answered. "First night," I confirmed. "How does it feel?" I looked around my kitchen, at the boxes still to unpack, at Robert's good knife on the counter where I'd set it when I put away the kitchen things, the one he'd bought in 1987 and maintained with a fanaticism I'd teased him about for 30 years and was now grateful for because it was still the best knife I'd ever used. At the mug in my hand, chipped and warm. "It feels like mine," I said. Dorothea made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something else. "Good," she said. "That's exactly what it should feel like." We talked for a while. She told me Ruth wanted to come visit in June to see the garden, because Ruth had opinions about gardens that required expression in person. I said June was fine, June was wonderful, come in June, and we'd have lunch on the terrace Ethan had fixed, and Ruth could tell me everything she thought should be planted where. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time without doing anything in particular. The tea cooled. I held it anyway. Here is what I know now, at the end of this. There are people in the world who will look at you and see only what you cost them, your time, your presence, your claim on the love of someone they want entirely for themselves. Those people will work, with patience and precision, to reduce you, to make you smaller, to find the version of you they can manage, and then to install that version so gradually that you don't notice until you're sitting in a kitchen with a stranger's apron and a bowl of soup while a dining room full of people pretend not to know what has just happened to you. And you can absorb that for a while. You can say lovely and mean nothing by it, and hold your hand steady and wait. I am not judging the years I waited. I needed them to understand what I was dealing with and to prepare for it properly. But there is a point past which waiting becomes complicity in your own diminishment. There is a moment when patience crosses over into surrender, and you have to know which side of that line you're on. I had crossed it, without realizing, somewhere in those 7 years. And then I had to cross back. Crossing back cost me things. It cost me the version of my relationship with Ethan that had, whatever its problems, at least been familiar. It cost me months of legal work and uncertainty, and the particular exhaustion of being in the right. The right, when being in the right, is not simple or painless. It cost me the comfortable story I had told myself, that things were difficult but manageable, that Celeste would eventually soften, that Ethan would eventually find his way back to me without anyone having to force the issue. None of those things were true. I had known they weren't true for years, and I had kept telling the story anyway, because the true story required action, and action is frightening, and I was, for a long time, more frightened than I admitted to myself. What I gained was harder to name, but easier to feel. It lived in the steadiness of my hands on the steering wheel of my car, driving to Harrow Hill for the last time as a guest. It lived in the envelope placed without force on a table. It lived in the 12 minutes of crying alone in my kitchen, and the washing of my face afterward, and the standing up, and the going on. It lived in Ethan's voice saying, "I'm sorry," in the raw, real way, and in my own voice saying it's a beginning and meaning it without requiring it to be more than that. It lived here, in this house, in this kitchen, in the first night of a life I had chosen fully and without apology. Celeste and Ethan did not reconcile. That news came to me in July, through Ethan, in a phone call that was hard to give and hard to receive. She had filed for divorce from Scottsdale, which meant the lawyers would take several more months to finish what had started at a December dinner table with a manila envelope and 22 witnesses. I did not feel triumphant about this. I want to be clear about that too. A marriage ending is not a victory, even a marriage that had been used as a weapon. It was simply what happened. The consequence of choices that had been made long before I placed any documents anywhere. Ethan moved into a small apartment in town. He called me every Sunday, without fail, from a number I recognized, at a time he chose rather than a time the schedule of someone else's yoga class allowed. The calls were imperfect, sometimes awkward, sometimes brief, sometimes interrupted by the ordinary disasters of a man reorganizing his life from the ground up. But they were his. He was making them from himself, not from the managed version of himself, and that mattered more than the awkwardness. We had dinner together in August, at Harrow Hill, at the table in the dining room that I had set myself with the dishes I'd brought from my apartment, and the flowers I'd cut from the garden that Ruth had helped me plan in June. Not a formal dinner, not a performance, just a meal, the two of us, with food I had cooked and wine he brought, and the long August evening coming through the windows. Halfway through dinner, he said, "I keep thinking about Dad, about what he would say." "Me too," I said. "What do you think he'd say?" "About all of this?" I thought about Robert, about the specific weight and timbre of his voice, about the way he'd looked at me across 31 years of dinners, not unlike this one, different rooms, different plates, the same essential thing. "I think he'd say we got there," I said. "Eventually." Ethan looked at his wine glass for a moment. Then he looked up at me, and in his face, in the lines that were his father's lines and the eyes that were more his own, I saw something I had been hoping to see for longer than I could say. Not happiness, exactly. Not yet. But something that lived in the same territory. Something that looked like a man beginning, slowly and at real cost, to know who he was. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think he would." We finished dinner. We did the dishes together, which neither of us were particularly efficient at, and the kitchen was too small for two people trying to navigate it simultaneously. And we got in each other's way 3 times and both apologized for the wrong one, and it was ordinary and human and completely, entirely ours. After he left, I turned off the kitchen light and walked through the house in the August dark. Not for any particular reason, but because it was mine to walk through. Room to room. The study with Robert's desk, the living room with my books, the hallway with the wall where I had taken down Celeste's photographs and not yet decided what to put in their place. I was in no hurry. That wall could wait. The right things would find it eventually. I came to the tall window in the living room and stopped. The garden was in full summer darkness outside, Ruth's suggestions already beginning to show, the beds that had been Celeste's precise and aesthetic arrangements now loosening into something wilder and more honest. Things growing the way they wanted to grow, with some guidance but without the rigidity of someone who needed the garden to look a certain way for photographs. I stood there in my house, in the dark, at 63 years old, and I thought about the woman who had driven to this gate in October with a jazz station on the radio and 30 seconds of sitting in her car before she got out and walked to the door. I thought about what that woman had known and what she hadn't, and what she'd been afraid of and what she hadn't yet understood about herself. She had understood more than she gave herself credit for. She had been braver than she felt. She had held things together in rooms that were designed to unmake her, and she had walked out of all of them standing. And she had come home. Not to the apartment with the rattling windows, not to the smallness of a life arranged around other people's comfort. She had come home to this, to the house, to the sun. She was slowly rebuilding something real to the self she had never quite abandoned even when she'd gotten very far from it. I pressed one hand flat against the cool glass of the window. Outside, the garden breathed in the summer dark, and the ridge was out there somewhere in the distance, the one I drove past every time I came and went, with its trees that Robert had said looked like they were arguing with the sky. They had leaves now. Full summer leaves, dark and certain, and exactly where they were supposed to be. I left my hand on the glass for a moment. Then I went to bed. I slept well. I always sleep well now. In my house. In the room I chose. In the life I claimed back from the people who thought it was theirs to arrange. That's not a small thing. That's everything.